There are moments in life when everything around us seems to dissolve. The familiar voices grow distant, the steady rhythm of our daily routines falters, and we find ourselves in an unsettling quiet. It is in these moments of solitude that we often ask, why? Why has this happened? Why have the people I once relied on faded into the background? Why do I feel so alone? But what if the question is not why am I alone, but why have I been called to this solitude? Because that is precisely what it is, a calling, a summons. We have been conditioned to believe that solitude is a sign of failure, of abandonment, of being forgotten. We assume that if we are left alone, something must be wrong with us or with our lives, and so we rush to fill the silence, to drown it out with noise, distractions, and the company of others, sometimes even the wrong company, simply to escape the discomfort of being alone. But what if solitude is not a punishment but a gift? What if, rather than being left behind, we are actually being drawn closer to something far greater than ourselves? History and Scripture repeatedly show us that those who are called to something great are first called into solitude. Moses was led away from the bustling halls of Egypt to the quiet wilderness before he was called to lead a nation. Elijah, after his great triumph over the prophets of Baal, was sent to a cave to hear God's whisper. Even Christ himself withdrew into the wilderness for 40 days before beginning his ministry. These were not moments of abandonment, but moments of preparation. Solitude is a sacred training ground where strength, wisdom, and clarity are forged in silence. In solitude, distractions are stripped away, and we come face to face with truths we have long ignored. We see ourselves as we truly are, without the noise of the world to validate or deceive us. More importantly, we become more attuned to the voice of God, which is so often drowned out by the chaos of everyday life. The question is, will we embrace this calling, or will we resist it? Those who run from solitude run from growth, but those who accept it will find that they were never truly alone to begin with. They were simply being drawn into a presence far greater than any crowd. There is a reason we avoid silence, a reason we reach for distractions the moment solitude settles in. We are afraid of what we might find when the noise disappears. Most people spend their lives surrounded by the constant hum of conversation, entertainment, and activity, not because they love it, but because they fear what happens when it stops. We dread being alone, not because of the absence of others, but because in that absence we come face to face with the one person we have never truly confronted, ourselves. In solitude, the carefully crafted image we present to the world begins to crack. There is no one left to impress, no validation to seek, no applause to earn. We are left only with who we really are, beneath the layers of reputation, status, and self-deception. And for many, that is a terrifying thought, because deep down we suspect that we are not as wise as we pretend to be, not as strong as we wish to be, and not as good as we claim to be. When left alone with our thoughts, we must finally face the insecurities, regrets, and sins that we so skillfully bury beneath the distractions of daily life. But there is something even more unsettling about solitude than meeting ourselves. We meet God. As long as we are surrounded by noise, we can keep him at arm's length, treating him as a distant idea rather than a present reality. But when we are alone, there is nowhere to hide. In the quiet, his presence becomes undeniable. And that can be unnerving because we know that to encounter God is to change. He does not leave us as we are. He reveals the truth about us, the truth we would rather ignore. He exposes our weaknesses, our false securities, our misplaced affections. And he calls us to something higher, something holier. Many resist solitude because they resist transformation. They would rather keep their illusions intact than face the refining fire of God's presence. But those who are willing to endure that moment of honest reckoning, those who stop running, who allow themselves to be truly seen find something they never expected. They find grace. They find that God's gaze, though piercing, is not condemning but loving. And they discover that the greatest fear was never of being alone, but of realizing they never were. Throughout history, the greatest spiritual encounters have not taken place in the midst of crowds, but in the silence of solitude. Again and again, we see a pattern in Scripture. Before God speaks, before he moves in a person's life in a profound way, he first draws them into isolation. This is not a coincidence, nor is it punishment. It is preparation. The biblical precedent for solitude is unmistakable. And when we examine it closely, we begin to see that those whom God intends to use, he first calls away. Consider Moses, raised in the luxury of Pharaoh's palace. He was surrounded by power, culture, and influence. Yet before he could lead Israel out of bondage, he had to first be led into the wilderness. For 40 years, he lived in exile, far from the comforts of Egypt, tending sheep in the desert. Alone, stripped of his former identity, Moses was humbled and reshaped. It was only then, when all distractions were gone, that he encountered God in the burning bush. His solitude was not abandonment, it was transformation. Elijah, too, was called into solitude. After his dramatic confrontation with the prophets of Baal, where fire fell from heaven in a miraculous display of God's power, Elijah did not march in victory, he fled. He found himself in the wilderness, alone and afraid, believing his life had no purpose. And yet it was in that place of isolation that God met him. Not in a whirlwind, nor in an earthquake, nor in a fire. Had Elijah remained in the noise of the world, he might never have heard that voice. Even Christ himself embraced solitude. Before he began his public ministry, he was led by the Spirit into the wilderness, where he fasted for 40 days. There he faced temptation, not in the presence of men, but in the absolute stillness of isolation. Why? Because solitude reveals who we truly are. It strips away every false comfort, every external support, and forces us to rely on God alone. God calls people into solitude not to punish them, but to prepare them. It is in these moments, when all else is removed, that we hear him most clearly, see ourselves most honestly, and emerge with the strength to fulfill the purpose he's set before us. Solitude is not the absence of God. It is often where he is found most profoundly. It is easy to mistake solitude for abandonment. When friends drift away, when familiar voices grow silent, when life no longer offers the comfort of companionship, we assume we have been forgotten. We ask, where is God? Why has he left me here, alone? But what if solitude is not a sign of forsakenness, but rather a sign of calling? What if the very loneliness we fear is in fact the evidence of God drawing us closer? Scripture is full of moments where God removes his chosen ones from the crowds, not to abandon them, but to teach them. Consider Joseph. Betrayed by his own brothers and left in a pit, he was sold into slavery and later thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit. By all appearances, he had been forsaken, but had he? Through his years of isolation, God was shaping him, preparing him for a position of incredible influence. What seemed like rejection was actually redirection toward a greater purpose that he could never have imagined. The same is true for David. Before he became king, he spent years alone in the wilderness, running for his life. He was anointed for greatness, yet he was not immediately given a throne. He was given solitude. In those years of isolation, he learned to rely on God, to seek him in the stillness, to trust him in the silence. The Psalms that comfort millions today were born in those quiet, lonely years. What felt like exile was actually training. Even Christ, in his final moments, experienced the depth of human loneliness. In Gethsemane, his closest friends fell asleep when he needed them most. On the cross he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And yet we know the truth. God had not abandoned him. His suffering had a purpose greater than any could comprehend. And in the silence of that moment, redemption was unfolding. Being alone does not mean being forsaken. The world may leave, friends may turn away, and comfort may vanish, but God remains. And if we find ourselves in solitude, perhaps it is not because we have been forgotten, but because we are being prepared. Perhaps he is leading us into the quiet, not to break us, but to build us, not to leave us empty, but to fill us in ways we never imagined. We are not alone. We are being called. Loneliness is often seen as something to be avoided, an unwelcome visitor that brings sorrow and isolation. But what if loneliness is not a punishment, but a tool? What if, instead of breaking us, it is meant to build us? God often uses seasons of solitude as a form of spiritual training, shaping us in ways that could never happen in the noise and busyness of daily life. When we are constantly surrounded by others, we can easily rely on their voices, their encouragement, and their opinions to shape our identity. But when we are alone, all of that is stripped away, and we are left with the raw truth of who we really are. This is the training ground of the soul, the place where God removes the crutches we have leaned on for too long, and teaches us to stand on faith alone. Look at the great figures of Scripture. Moses, Elijah, David, even Paul. Each of them was called into loneliness before they were called into leadership. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he was ready to lead Israel. Elijah hid in a cave and learned to hear God in a whisper. David, before he wore a crown, spent years as a fugitive, learning to trust God in the solitude of the wilderness. Paul, after his dramatic conversion, did not immediately begin preaching. He went away for years, being shaped by God in private before stepping into his public calling. This pattern is not accidental. Loneliness forces us to confront the things we might otherwise ignore, our fears, our doubts, our weaknesses. It humbles us, stripping away our self-sufficiency and teaching us to rely completely on God. In the silence, we learn to hear his voice more clearly. In the stillness, our faith is refined. But perhaps the greatest lesson of loneliness is this: we are never truly alone. It is in the moments when we feel most isolated that we often experience the presence of God in the deepest way. He does not leave us in the wilderness without purpose. He walks with us through it, strengthening us for what lies ahead. So instead of fearing loneliness, we should ask, what is God teaching me in this season? Because those who embrace solitude as training will emerge not weaker, but stronger, refined, prepared, and ready for the calling that awaits them. Transformation through stillness is a profound concept that involves the idea of growth and change emerging from moments of quiet reflection and inner calm. In a fast-pacing world where constant activity, noise, and stimulation often dominate, stillness becomes a powerful tool for personal evolution. Rather than seeking external achievements or constant motion, stillness offers the opportunity to turn inward, observe the present moment, and access a deeper level of self-awareness. The essence of transformation through stillness lies in the ability to pause and create space within oneself. It is in these pauses that true clarity arises. When we allow ourselves to be still, we can separate ourselves from the overwhelming distractions of life and reconnect with our core values, desires, and sense of purpose. It is during these moments that our mind has the opportunity to sift through the clutter, recognize patterns, and confront limiting beliefs or emotions that may have been clouding our perspective. Through stillness, individuals often experience a shift in their perception of the world. The practice allows one to become more attuned to the present, creating a profound sense of peace. This quiet moment can lead to breakthroughs in understanding, whether it be about oneself or the external environment. For example, meditation or mindful breathing are practices that can facilitate stillness, offering space to process emotions, reduce stress, and cultivate a balanced mindset. This process of internal alignment allows a person to approach life's challenges with a calm, centered mind. In the context of transformation, stillness also provides an essential opportunity to heal. It is often in moments of stillness that deep emotional wounds can surface, allowing for acknowledgement and release. Instead of being consumed by past pain or future anxieties, stillness enables the individual to accept the present and embrace personal growth. The energy freed up from mental and emotional clutter can be redirected towards growth, creativity, and developing new ways of thinking. Ultimately, transformation through stillness is about understanding that change does not always require outward action. It is in the quiet moments that